This is Michael Smook for YouTube Commentaries. I'm here today, Sunday, August 28th, 2016. I'm talking to you from Mesa, Arizona, and I'm here today to talk to you about a subject entitled The Hollywood Blacklist, Civil Liberties Under Siege. Today we're going to talk about the events which transpired in July 1947, whereby Hollywood screenwriters were subpoenaed to come to Washington, D.C. and to answer unconstitutional questions. And we're going to explain why did this happen, did it ever end, and could we ever be in a situation where civil liberties will once be under siege? And I'll close with my own personal comments. What happened was in July 1947, 10 of Hollywood's best screenwriters were subpoenaed by the Congress's House on Un-American Activities Committee. And they were asked two questions for starters. They were asked if they were members of the Communist Party, even though it wasn't a crime. And if they weren't currently members, they were asked had they ever been members, and then they would be asked if they had been members, did they know anyone who was a member of this organization. So it was not illegal to be a member of the Communist Party, and it was a violation of their constitutional rights. And the Hollywood 10 included Dalton Trumbo and Ring Lardner Jr. They were considered unfriendly witnesses, and they were not allowed to read statements into the congressional record nor hand them in. They were expected to simply give yes or no answers. The most memorable statement at those hearings was Ring Lardner Jr., who, when asked if his communist affiliation, said, "I would like to tell you what you want to hear, but if I did, I'd hate myself in the morning." Lardner was a man of principle, and he didn't want to betray his friends, or in the parlance of 1947, rat his friends out. Another one of the 10 who has a quote that's worth remembering, not at the time of the hearings or the Inquisition, Dalton Trumbo. Years later he was said, "Well, how did you feel about being held in contempt of Congress?" And Trumbo said, "I had contempt for Congress in 1947, and I have contempt for them now, decades later." So Trump showed anger but a wicked sense of humor, and I can't help but sometimes laughing that the man kept his sanity throughout all this. What happened to the Hollywood 10 as a result of these hearings and them standing, and the 10 standing on their constitutional rights, telling Congress that on the freedom of speech they could speak up or they could simply remain mute because it really wasn't Congress's business what their political affiliation was. In order to support their constitutional rights, the Hollywood 10 lived in a biblical sense, a modern-day biblical sense, a Job-like existence. They were found in contempt of Congress almost universally, except for 17 members. They were suspended by the Hollywood studios they were employed with, and they were also suspended by the unions which they helped found on a morals charge. Then after that, they were indicted on federal charges. They were tried in federal court and found guilty of being in contempt of Congress and received sentences of anywhere from 6 to 12 months. They were each fined $1,000. If you take $1,000 in 1947, that would be equal to building in the cost of inflation to getting a fine of anywhere from 10 to 11,000 today. So they went to prison, and before they went to jail, the U.S. Supreme Court decided not to hear the case and come to their aid in the sense that Congress had overreached and committed unconstitutional act. But the one body that could come to their rescue, the U.S. Supreme Court, did not come through. What happened to the Hollywood 10 after they received their prison sentences, they were able to find work, but in a circuitous way. They would take on pen names or pseudonyms. Some of them would have to travel to other countries, and or they would have to have fronts representing them. The fronts would represent them to the studios. The front's name would be on the script. The front would hand in the script, and then the blacklisted writer would be paid indirectly. The front would get paid, and then the front would split the fee with the blacklisted writer. So by 1951, when the Hollywood 10 had all been released from prison after doing their time, Congress's political witch hunt was ending, and an official blacklist was over, but an unofficial blacklist metastasized throughout American society. What happened was a newspaper called Red Channels was produced. The publishers would list names of actors and other entertainers who it believed were members of the Communist Party or communist sympathizers, and many of these people were live performers, radio performers, performers on the newly emerging TV or feature films, and they had no fronts to represent them. So many entertainers who were actors would have problems getting work and suffering through that. They would have to find jobs in other fields, and there was also a preponderance of depression, alcoholism, divorce among many entertainers, several hundred of them nationwide, and they had to suffer through this. Now, why did America go a little crazy in 1947? What happened in which civil liberties were under siege? What happened was there were events external to the U.S. After the United States defeated the Nazis, and we started sending our men and women home after World War II, feeling that we had defeated fascism, the Germans, also the Italians and the Japanese. At the same time, our allies, the Russians, occupied Eastern Europe, and they moved to the borders of Western Europe. Eastern Europe, from the north of the Baltic to the south to the Adriatic Seas, they built what was metaphorically called the Iron Curtain. And during that time, by 1947, the American and British press were stating that the United States and its allies were now engaged in a Cold War. So our new enemies, our former allies, the Soviets, they were joined by the Chinese. In 1949, the Chinese, the communists, defeated the nationalists. At that time, there were 600 million people in China. So at that time, what happened was another 600 million people fell behind the Iron Curtain. So between Soviet gains in Eastern Europe and the Chinese communists gaining control of their own mainland, a huge country, what happened was on the international front in the United States, after defeating the Nazis, we thought the world was safe, and now we were engaged in we had gone from a hot war to a cold war, and this had an effect on the United States, and that probably explains a lot of what Congress was doing. That in the sense of spying. At the same time, we're spying on the Soviets, the Chinese, and in Eastern Europe. The communists are spying in the United States. One example of spying is the Soviets were able to steal our atomic bomb secrets. They bribed American citizens. These citizens, the Rosenbergs, Julius and Ethel, they were caught after the secrets were already given to the Soviets. They were caught, tried, convicted, and executed. So this had a chilling effect throughout the United States, and that partially explains why in the United States civil liberties in the parlance of 2016 were thrown under the bus, and we engaged in a political witch hunt. And it became particularly important to find out whether Hollywood screenwriters and other people in the entertainment industry what their allegiances were. In the past, this wasn't important. Now, what happened after that? What happened after that was the Blacklist eventually ended. And it started to end in 1960. Dalton Trumbo, one of the Hollywood 10, was given contracts to write scripts for Exodus and Spartacus, two blockbuster Hollywood hits. By 1965, Ring Lardner Jr. was given a contract to co-write a script for another hit film, a Steve McQueen vehicle called The Cincinnati Kid. 6 years later, in 1971, Lardner was given an Academy Award for the 1970 comedy and anti-war film called MASH. And many people thought that was a vindication of Lardner sticking for his principles and surviving this political witch hunt. So throughout the 1960s, the Blacklist started to end. Other reasons which the Blacklist started to end after about 20 years stems from the fact, and this is my interpretation of history, I think the American people became far less concerned whether a screenwriter was a Democrat, Republican, or communist. I think the American people started, it was a time of revolutionary change, the 60s. And also, during the 60s, the American people began to distrust leadership in Washington, especially at the executive level. When John Kennedy was assassinated in November 1963, and in the following year, the Warren Commission determined that a sole gunman, Lee Harvey Oswald, was able to kill the president with a sniper rifle, which he bought mail order for. It's an Italian-made bolt-action rifle, cost $17, and the American people had a lot of had some skepticism. Many American people that Kennedy was killed by a lone gunman. There had to be a conspiracy of sort. This is arguably the most important position in the United States and one of the most powerful men on the planet, and yet to be killed by a sole gunman, people started to doubt their government. And then following that, Lyndon Johnson, who could have been a great president, never partnered with the American people over the Vietnam War, and we seemed to muddle our way through escalating the war. And at one point we had between 500,000 and 600,000 troops in a war that was never a declared war. It became very unpopular. There were demonstrations on campuses. Johnson didn't do well in initial primaries, and he decided not to run for re-election. So even though history is going to be kinder to Lyndon Johnson, he didn't run for re-election. He succeeded Kennedy, but in some ways he's looked upon as a failed presidency. Johnson's successor, Richard Nixon, he had a remarkably great history and accomplishments as a foreign policy president in terms of improving political, economic relations with the Soviet Union and with China. And also, he, working with the Secretary of State, was able to engage in nuclear disarmament with the Soviets. And we engaged in what was called détente with the Russians. And the Cold War started to be less cold. But Nixon's problem was he was condoned a break-in to Democratic National Headquarters, and this was an illegal act, and he wanted to get even with his enemies. And Nixon's undoing was the cover-up was worse than the crime. He approved the paying off of the burglars who were caught, and all the evidence to convict him was on tapes which he kept. So Nixon could have been a great president, and instead he resigned in disgrace. And then his successor, Gerald Ford, pardoned him. So between Kennedy's assassination, Johnson and Nixon resigning and leaving as failed presidents, and then Ford pardoning Nixon, there was a a lack of trust in executive leadership at the highest levels of the American government. So when you look back to the 60s, it was a time of revolutionary change, and the American people started to distrust their leadership. And so that was a change in the 50s, when we were far more concerned about whether screenwriters and entertainers, whether or not they were Democrat, Republicans, or communists. So the thing about it, the next thing we need to talk about is it possible if a blacklist could happen again, and whether civil liberties could be under siege? Ring Lardner in the early 60s, just before he went back to work with his name on screen credits, Lardner was saying, do you think it could happen again? And Lardner said, it can happen again, but in a different way. Now it's 55 years later, and we're looking at 2016. Is it possible that a blacklist could happen again? Civil liberties under siege? When you look at the 2016 presidential races, the Republican candidate for presidency, he's saying slanderous things about Muslims, Mexicans, and women. He's talking about building a wall on the U.S.-Mexican border, which would certainly interfere with trade between our countries. He's talking about slapping tariffs against Chinese and other countries we trade with, so that would engage in an economic war with other countries. He's talking about deporting between 11 and 12 million residents here who are undocumented, and without any discussion about a roadmap to giving them legal guest worker status or citizenship. He's engaging in loose talk, where he's talking about if the Soviets invade some of our NATO allies in Eastern Europe or in Western Europe. He's talking about reserving the right not to intervene on their behalf because they're not paying their full share for defense. So what the Republican nominee is doing is he's turning everything upside down, and he's creating an unsettling atmosphere. In addition, what's going on international front, we see in the Middle East and Africa, we see war, murder and mayhem. We see terrorist attacks in Belgium and France, terrorist attacks in the United States. We also see our competitors, the Russia and China, are using computers to hack into government databases and the databases of the Democratic National Committee, and possibly into our Fortune 500 companies. So with the new technologies today, we're under attack from our adversaries now. So there are a lot of things that are going on internationally and nationally, and it's a cause of concern. And it's my perception that when there's a lot of upheaval internationally and domestically, that sometimes the American people lose sight of what Lincoln would call the better angels of our nature, and civil liberties sometimes are disregarded. So I'm optimistic about the future. I think there are many things that we can do, and I'm hopeful for a progressive agenda in the 2016 election. The remedies to what we're talking about, the Hollywood blacklist, civil liberties under siege, can it happen today, and the remedies that are possible, I think that they're out there, and we don't have enough time to really go into details in this YouTube commentary. But we will talk again, and also just to let you know that if you go to my internet blog, Michael Smoot Google+, the name of the blog is called We're All in This Together, and I do discuss the current system, and I do offer remedies in terms of foreign policy and domestic issues and solutions. So we will chat again, but go to my blog, read my blog, and we could talk more about it. But until then, it's been a pleasure talking to you. This is Michael Smook for YouTube Commentaries. It's Sunday, August 28th, and I'm calling in and speaking to you from Mesa, Arizona. Until next time, goodbye and good luck.